Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we get started, if you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you listened to episodes 58 or 59, you'll remember tonight's guest, Josh Turner. Since Josh was last on the show, he's collected several more encounters that he's here to share with you tonight. Josh, thanks so much for coming back.
Oh, no problem. Glad to be back.
It's good to have you back. So what have you been up to since that last show?
Well, I've been working a lot, spending a lot of time working out on post. I have a security business. I think I pointed that out last time. I have a security company, and we've been so slammed that I've been having to work too, and work has finally slowed down. But for about, 9 months, it was just nothing but just work. And I was having to go out and sit post. And that's where I picked up these stories, actually, was through that.
So you have to sit in the dark all alone on post, knowing all these stories about dogmen.
Yeah. Yep. And it could be, that's nerve wracking. It can be, yeah, you're right.
Oh, I'll bet it can be nerve-wracking. Before you tell us about those stories you've got for us tonight, why do you think so many more people are having dogman encounters as time goes by?
Well, what used to be considered the frontier is now where people are living. People are moving, the sprawl. And I see it a lot here in Austin because my business centers around that. We do a lot of security for construction companies. And so I think that the urban sprawl is contributing to the sightings, because where people used to go hunting and fishing is now where people are living. And now they're going deeper into the woods to do those activities, and that's where they're encountering these things, dogman or Sasquatch or whatever it is they're running into. I think that these things have always been out there, and they were able to hide a little better. Another thing I believe is that as these things become acclimated to people, I think that they're a little less wary of us. They're not hiding. When you hear stories about Bigfoot in Alaska, I had a guy that was talking about Bigfoot in Alaska and how in his mind, they're more aggressive. I think it's because they're not as used to people. They see somebody, they don't know what you are. They just know you're an intruder. Whereas if somebody runs into one of these things, and like I said, I haven't really been given many Bigfoot stories, so I can't verify the veracity of these accounts, but I've heard of people saying that they're a little more docile, like they're not really interested in hurting you. They've seen people before, so they just walk away. But, the stories that were coming out of places like Alaska, Russia, places like that is of aggression. And I think it's because they're not as used to seeing people.
What you're saying makes good sense. I mean, beef cows are a lot more difficult to handle than dairy cows for a reason. Dairy cows are brought into the barn and milked every day, whereas beef cows are just left out there in the pasture to fatten up. So what you're saying there does make good sense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They've become acclimated to people.
Yeah, I'll bet you're right on that. I think another reason why encounters are reported more often now than they used to be is because of the improved communication we have. If you think about it, back in the day, communication was nothing compared to what it is now.
One of the things that's going on with communication is that we have so much information at our fingertips that if someone has an encounter, then they can tell people about it immediately. And it's all over the internet the minute that someone says, hey, I saw something, and it's on social media, it's instantaneous. And that can also lead to another problem too, which I've tried to be leery of, is people telling you bullcrap. I had been bombarded with people sending me messages and things after I was on your show. Some of these stories were so unbelievable. You're just like, wow, I don't even know what to make of that. One guy tells me he is a werewolf. And he was like, he said he was going to send me photos of himself and of changing and all this stuff, and nothing ever happened. And it was just like, whatever, dude. It creates a platform, I think, for charlatans too. People that are just trying to catch attention or whatever.
Yeah, I guess like anything, you have good things you take away from it as well as bad things. But I can tell you, I definitely don't want to go back to the way communication used to be 20 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. I'm agreeing with you on that. I don't think that I would have ever been able to come to terms with what happened to me fully. Because I feel like when I went on your show the first time, that I exercised that demon, to actually be able to sit there and speak about it. We had just talked about, me and you, about getting anxiety when you talk about your encounter. I don't really feel the same way when I talk about other people's encounters. It's a lot easier for me because I didn't live through their experience. It's not as tangible for me. What happened to me was like, I know that happened to me.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's to be expected. If you're sitting there talking about an encounter you had personally, of course, that's going to be a lot more difficult for you to do than to sit there and talk about someone else's encounter. Well, Josh, you've got a load of dogman encounters to tell us about tonight, so please start with whichever one you want to and take it from there.
Okay, here's what happened. When I was working, I worked for a large company that builds homes in and around the Austin area. I can't give the name of it, of course, but it's a client of ours, and they have a lot of contractors that work for them. Working for these companies, we're there late at night. We get there in the early evening, and we're there all night, and we're there till the morning. And most of the contractors arrive before we leave. So you get to know the people that work there, and you become friends with them, a lot of them. If you're doing your job, usually they like that you're there and you guard their stuff. They can leave their stuff there. They know that it's not going to get stolen. And we have a pretty good track record. We've worked for a lot of big companies. And so I got to be friends with a few of these contractors, and that's how I met the people that I'm going to talk about today. These stories were given to me back in like June, but I haven't had a chance to scratch my head, much less get in touch with you to tell you, hey, I got some information. And at the time, I like to hear people's encounters, any kind of paranormal encounters, whether it's ghosts or anything. I'll listen to somebody talk about that, and sometimes I guess I can be steering the conversation that way just to see if I can find something from somebody that knows about something that may have happened to them. But this particular gentleman that I'm going to talk about, we became friends. And the reason that me and him began to talk about this subject is because he heard me listening to your show. I was listening to your show one morning, and he came in. He was standing outside talking to the guy that does the sod. This guy that I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to call him Jerry, and I'm going to call him Hernandez. That's not his real name, but I told him that I have permission to tell his stories, but I don't really want to say his real name because I don't want people harassing him or going onto his property. When I was listening to your show, he came up to me and we started talking, and your show was playing, and I work so much that I have to work out on post. So when I'm out in the post, a lot of times I'll take my kettlebells and my weights and I'll be out there lifting. I usually wait until right before dawn to do it. So I was out there lifting, and it sounds kind of silly, but you have to stay in shape. So anyways, he comes up to me and he starts BSing with me like he always does. The show was playing and there was one of your guests. I'm not going to mention it, whatever, but he was listening. He kind of started listening and he goes, what is she talking about? And I said, it's a show called, and for a minute there, I thought this guy's he's going to think I'm crazy. You know what I mean? Like I didn't want to start, I didn't start going, hey, yeah, I saw something and did you see anything? That's not how it happened. It just kind of happened naturally. And I told him, I said, what's a show? It's called Dogman Encounters. And he just at first he kind of laughed, like kind of scoffed. And I thought, oh man, this dude, he already thinks this is silly. So I cut it off. No offense, Vic, but I cut the show off. And so we started talking and he's like, what is a dogman? Like, what is that? And I started to describe it to him. I said, well, what it is these people go on this show. And at that point, I didn't tell him that I'd been on your show. I said, these people go on this show and they talk about their encounters. They see these things that look like werewolves. And he's like, really? And I said, yeah, but the term has become a catch-all term for any of these creatures that people see. It's called Dogman. And he's like, Dogman? I said, yeah, that's what it's called. And he was like, well, that's interesting. He's like, now these dogmen, what do they look like? And I said, well, it varies. People see different versions of this, but roughly it's a werewolf. That's what it looks like, a traditional werewolf, something on two legs. At that point, he kind of snapped to, and he was like, holy, I don't want to say the curse word, but holy crap. He goes, we've been seeing these things on my property since I was a kid. And that's when I asked him, I was like, where do you live? And he's like, I live, and he told me, outside of Austin, and I'll give you the town that it's close by to, but that's as far as I'm going to go, near Wimberley. It's out by the Blanco River. It's outside of Wimberley. So anyway, he tells me they had been seeing these things for a long time. And when I asked him to elaborate further, I said, well, have you seen anything? Did you see something? He's like, yeah, He's like, I saw one time, and that was it. He's like, but my family can tell you a lot of different stories about this. Now, his family works with him. He's the foreman for his crew. They install the cabinets and do the counters and all that. And his uncle, his dad's youngest brother, he works with him. And so does his other brother, his younger brother. But they were working on a different site. And that other site I worked at periodically too. Wherever I was needed, I would fill in. Wherever I couldn't put a guard, I would do it myself. So I knew who he was talking about. Now, his younger brother, I'm not going to give his name either. I'm going to call him Robert or Robbie. He had a pretty terrifying encounter. Me and you had discussed that, and I'm going to give the details about that encounter. But first, I wanted to get into what he told me. Now, at that point in time, the conversation just kind of ended. He says, hey, I got to get back to work, but I'll talk to you later. So he went back in and he started doing what he was doing, and I finished my sets and I went home. But the next day, I was eager to see him again. So I came in a little bit early. He was finishing up when I got there. Now, the funny thing was, I pay attention to details. Him and his uncle, they would always leave before dark. Now, a lot of these workers, these contractors, the drywallers, whatever, they'll stay and they'll work past dark. But he was always packed up and ready to go by dark. So I got there early and I started shooting the breeze with him. And I mentioned that to him. I said, hey, you about to leave? And he said, yeah, I'm about to take off. And I said, why do you always leave before dark? And he kind of smiled and he goes, man, let me tell you, I don't stay any of these job sites after dark. He's like, we're out in the country right now. I just don't trust it. And so when I questioned him about it, I kind of lead it into it. I said, does this pertain to that thing that we were talking about? And he's like, yeah, I guess. I said, what happened to you? Do you mind telling me? And he kind of looked at me and he goes, man, you think I was crazy. And I said, look, I was listening to that show. I opened up to him and I said, look, I had an encounter myself with one of these things. And he's like, mentiroso, that means liar in Spanish. And I said, no. I said, for real. I said, I'll tell you what happened to me if you have a little bit of time. And he goes, yeah. So he went and sat down the tailgate and we started bullcrapping. And one of his guys was with him and they were standing there. And he said, are you going to tell him about this thing that happened to you? And he goes, well, I'm going to hear his story first. So I said, all right. Started talking to him and I told him about my encounter. Looked him dead in his eye and told him everything that had happened to me. And I told him that I had heard a lot of stories over the years from people who have had similar encounters with these things. Now, it's interesting when I talked to his people, when they talked about their encounters, they never called it a wolfman or a werewolf. They always just said these things or these creatures. They didn't really have a name for it, which makes sense why he didn't know what the heck a dogman was. Because I guess not everybody is as interested as we are in finding the truth about what these things are. They're just like, hey, they're on our property. That's just the reality they deal with. But apparently a lot of people in that area have seen these things. They know what they are. A little sidelight before I go any further. Years ago, I used to go out with a girl. Her family was from Blanco. Her mother lived in Blanco. And I remember they lived out on the edge of town. And we went out there a couple times. It was nice. It was like fall. We were out on the porch in the backyard. And right before dark, they just got up and everybody went inside. And I was like, that's kind of odd. And I remember asking her mother, is there a reason why everybody just packed up and went in? She goes, oh, we just don't hang out after dark outside. She's like, there's prowlers. And I'm like, prowlers? I know country folk had always spoke of these supposed prowlers. I've heard all these stories about people that just prowled around, and I thought that was kind of a flimsy excuse. I didn't ask for any explanations. I wasn't going to press her mother and be like, tell me the real reason. But looking back on that, I always thought that was odd. So anyways, I don't know if that has anything to do with this, but it's in the same region. So I'm thinking, who knows? Maybe there is something to this. I know I've heard a lot of stories in that region about ghosts and a lot of different activity. There's a place called Devil's Backbone. It's been on Unsolved Mysteries. Basically, a lot of people talking about their encounters with spirits. So I know that the region is considered haunted, but I had never heard anybody talk about dogman activity. And of course, to us here in Texas, I think dogman is probably only about 10-year-old term. It's not really something that people have ever called these things. I know in my hometown, we don't call them dogman. Anyways, let me get back to this. His encounter was pretty basic. It wasn't real terrifying. There wasn't a lot of drama involved, but it gave him proof that what his uncles and his grandfather and his dad had been saying over the years was legit. It was real. And so what happened was, he said it was the day before Christmas Eve. So I guess this would have been December 23rd. He told me the year too. He said it was 2006. And he said that his little kids were decorating the Christmas tree with some pine cones or something. And his youngest daughter at that time, he said she was like 4 or 5. I can't remember which. And he said his little boy was like 8 or 9. I think he said he was 8. I don't remember the ages exactly. Anyways, he said that the little girl and the little boy were looking out the window, and the little boy says, "Look, Daddy, a bunny." And he thought, "Oh, that's odd, a bunny, middle of winter. That's not normal." So he went outside and he looked, and he thought maybe there was like a bunny rabbit that had come out of its burrow or something. So anyway, he came outside to look, and he looked down and he didn't see anything, and the little girl started crying. He didn't know why she was crying, and to this day, he still says he doesn't really know if it was what she was looking at made her cry, or if it was his expression. You know how little kids will follow the parent, and the parent will make an expression, and the child will cry, or whatever. But he said she started bawling, and so he picked her up, and when he picked her up, and he got her right there in his arms, he looked straight ahead. That's when he saw this thing that was halfway behind the tree, and it had his arm around the tree, that it came out from behind the tree. And he said, "I saw it clear as day." And he said this tree was about 60 yards from the house, and it was just standing there looking right at him. When I asked him, "How big do you estimate this thing to have been?" his exact words to me, he said it was probably about 7 feet tall. And he said it had reddish brown fur and an elongated snout and pointy ears. And he said he didn't remember the hands or the feet. He just remembers looking at the creature from a distance, and he saw that. He said that he called his wife, and he was like, "Honey, can you come take the kid," or whatever? And she was like, "I'm busy," because she was making tamales. And he said, "Can you come take the kid? Come here now." And so she came out to the living room. He gave her the child, and he's like, "I need to go get my gun." And she's like, "Why?" And he pointed to the window. And the little boy, I guess, was still kind of excited. And he thought it was like some kind of big bunny, because he said it had really tall ears, which was weird. Like, I don't remember him going into detail about the ears, but he did tell me that it had big ears. I was in my mind thinking like Wile E. Coyote, you know, like the big ears. And I was thinking, I wonder how big these ears were that the little kid would think that it looked like a bunny. But anyway, I should have asked more details, but I didn't. I didn't want to interrupt him. He was telling the story. And he went inside, grabbed his 30-06 and went back out and was going to take a shot at it. He goes out onto the porch and it's gone. Now here's the question I asked him. I said, "Jerry, you have your kids and your wife there. You weren't worried about going out on the porch, this thing maybe becoming aggressive and attacking?" And he said, "No, I always felt pretty secure around my property." He's like, "But the funny thing was, I have 4 big dogs and none of them were anywhere to be found." And he said, at that point, I'd had to go check the property and just make sure this thing wasn't lurking around because I was worried. And so I said, "Where were the dogs?" He says, "Well, I don't know." At that point, he didn't see the dogs and they weren't barking, which is weird. So he goes around, he checks the front of the property, he walks around the back of the property. Once he gets around the back of the property, the dogs were all in the backyard by one corner of the house on the opposite end from where he was at. So the dogs all kind of ran up to him and were like all close to him. Now I thought, maybe it's because he has like small wimpy dogs or something. He said he had big dogs, but not all big dogs are tough. I mean, like a lab is not a really vicious dog. So what kind of dogs did you have? Now he told me he had 2 German Shepherds, a pit bull mix. Yeah. And I'm thinking they're all big dogs. They're all pretty tough dogs. He said I had a pretty tough mutt. He was just mixed up. He said, but all 4 of them were pretty rough trade. And so I'm thinking, why were they not barking? That's weird. I don't even know why they would not be growling or barking if something's that close to the house. He couldn't figure it out either. And his wife was frantic to make him come back inside. And as he told me growing up over the years, he had heard stories about these things, but he had never seen one before. Now, that was his sole encounter because he did tell me that was the only thing that he had ever seen was that one particular creature. And I told him, I said, wow, that's a crazy story. And he said, but he goes, my family has seen these things. He goes, I grew up hearing stories about these things. And he goes, and until my brother had his encounter, I always just kind of thought it was just stories they told us to scare us, to keep us safe, come inside when it's dark. But, most country people, they're not afraid of the dark and they don't go inside when it's dark. They're not worried about the boogeyman. They live out in the country. They're used to seeing bobcats, coyotes, coy wolves, whatever. I mean, just me on post, I've seen bobcats and I've seen coyotes and all kinds of manner of animals, big old bucks. They'll come right through wherever you're working. You know, if you're out there in the edge of the woods, Austin is surrounded by woods, and we have a lake. Well, it's the Lower Colorado River, and it crisscrosses all over this area. It's so wide, they call it Lake Austin, Town Lake, and then Lake Travis, but it's really just the Lower Colorado River in different areas. So, anyways, he was saying he never thought anything of it. But after that, after he actually saw one and knew 100% that it was real, he was like, dude, he had already started to kind of believe, but he said that when his brother had his encounter, that's when he knew this was real. That one time he saw something, that was the nail in the coffin. And now what he told me was his brother had had an encounter and that I should ask his brother about his encounter because it was a lot more terrifying than what had happened to him. This time he said, if you count what happened with my brother, he's like, I guess I've seen it twice, but I don't really want to say it because it was so dark that I didn't really get a good look at it. But his brother did. So what I did was when I worked the other site, I purposely went to work the other site one day. And I went in early at that site. I switched with the guard so I could talk to his brother because his brother was the lead foreman over at the other site. And so I went over there and I talked to him, and they were installing the cabinets or whatever like they always do. And I had talked to his brother on a few occasions, not as many times as I talked to Jerry, but I had met his brother before, and I had worked that site on occasion, but it wasn't a regular thing. So I kind of pinned him down. I said, hey, man, you got a minute? And he said, yeah, dude, I'm getting ready to leave. And they were packing up their stuff. And same thing as I did with Jerry. I said, hey, I was just curious. I had talked to your brother about this dogman encounter you had. And he kind of looked at me and I said, dogman, I know that you probably don't know that term. It's what people call these things that you guys were seeing on the property. And he kind of shook his head. He said, oh, gotcha. Okay. And I said, can you tell me what happened with your encounter? And he was like, sure, but I can't do it today. I'm in a hurry. So I made it a point to go back, that same site, go in early, whatever. So the next time I saw him, he actually had a friend with him the next day. And I guess this guy was a guy that worked with him off and on or whatever. And he was also a neighbor who actually that neighbor, his name is Shane. That's what I'm going to call him. It was actually his family's property. And I guess Jerry and his brother Robbie's grandfather actually worked on that property for Shane's great-grandfather, if you're following me. And I guess that it was all Shane's great-grandfather's property at one time. And they actually bought, I guess his grandfather he was a vaquero. He was a cowboy. He worked for them. They had a bunch of cattle out there. And he was like the lead guy for them for a long time. And I guess when they decided to partition the land off and sell it, he bought a tract of that land. His land lies to the south, kind of the southwest from what they described to me, of Shane's property. Now, Shane is the guy that was there that day with him. And he said, this is Shane. He's our neighbor, our nearest neighbor. And he's got 147 acres of land where he lives. And then their uncle, which would be, I'm trying not to get you confused here, would be Robbie and Jerry, the guy that told me his encounter. Their uncle Abel and their uncle Noah have tracts of land that were passed down from their grandfather. And their dad's name is Andrew. Okay. So there were 4 brothers. There was Andrew, Noah, Abel, and then the other guy they called Jojo. He's the youngest, Joseph. Now he had an encounter too that I'm going to get into, but it wasn't on the ranch. He doesn't live out on the ranch. He lives in Buda. Okay. And little backstory to him, he was kind of the black sheep of the family. He always kind of made fun of these guys, like, oh yeah, you're seeing these kokoi, and kind of joked about it and thought it was cute and funny to tease them. And he had told them, yeah, if I ever see one of these things, I'm going to knock it out. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And they were just like, yeah, right. Well, anyways, he worked directly with Jerry over at the first site that I was telling you about. Now I would see him regularly, and that night, Jerry and his uncle, they showed up over there at the property where I had gone in to work early the second time. And they were all there. They all showed up and they were standing around having a beer because a lot of times these contractors will do that. And usually I don't allow that, but they're pretty good guys. And we had agreed they were going to tell me the stories. So I had them all there together, and Robbie told me his story. I keep trying to make sure I say that name and not his real name. His story was really scary. Now, what happened to him, and this guy, when he was telling me this story, he looked me right in my eye. I could tell this guy wasn't lying. I mean, I guess it is possible that these guys all got together and conspired to lie to me, maybe thinking I was gullible or something, but I don't believe that. They were very sincere about it, and they were very open and honest about it. And Robbie told me that when he was 17 years old, that he was out on his four-wheeler riding around on the property. His mother was always very adamant about him coming home on time, and he said that she would always use the excuse of coming home for dinner to get him to come home before dark. And he was the youngest. He was the youngest of Andrew's sons, okay? And that, like I said, is the four brothers, and their dad was the one that bought the property. So Jerry and Robbie, and then their brother, Andre, they are all the sons of Andrew. And now Andrew would be the youngest son, or the second to youngest son of those four brothers I was telling you about. And those are all the neighbors of Shane. Okay? So if you follow that, okay, I hope everybody can follow that. Okay, so anyways, that's the back, just to let you know. And this property is pretty big. It's well over 1,000 acres of altogether. It's pretty big. So anyways, what these guys were telling me was that each one of them had something like some sort of encounter. So we'll start with Robbie's encounter. He was out on his ATV. He rode out to a stand that they had that they would use to hunt hogs. And in Texas, everybody knows Texas, there's hogs everywhere. We have a problem with hogs. Most counties offer bounties on hogs. If you bring them a tail, like I was telling you, Vic, me and a buddy of mine were in Lockhart, and he was shooting them off of his back porch out on the edge of town. Well, out in the country, but it's still it's not far out of town. And that's because there's so many. They're just everywhere. They're causing a lot of problems. They're a nuisance animal. So anyways, he was telling me this story, and he said that he was in the stand hunting hogs, and his mother called. And he told her, look, I'm out here in the stand. I'm trying to kill something. He was learning how to bow hunt. So he had his bow with him. Now, he did say he had a pistol, too. So he told me, he said, I'm sitting there with my bow. For the first time, he's like, I really told my mom, look, I'll be home when I'm ready. And she got upset, and he hung up. So he sat there for a couple more hours, and right before it got dark, he said that the sun was already starting to go down in the back, the backdrop, because he was facing the west. He said that there's a lot of trees. It's kind of like a hollow. It's a lot of trees there, and there's like a little clearing. And he said that he saw something, the bushes start to move, and he saw something. He thought that, first he said he thought it dropped down out of a tree. And then he thought, well, that can't be right. But then he said that it was kind of creeping around behind some bushes. And he thought he saw the silhouette of this thing stand up. And then he thought, maybe my eyes are playing tricks on me. But then it was on all fours again. And he thought, is this a bear? And then he thought, no way, there's no bears out here, And so he had some binoculars. He said, so he lifted up the binoculars and he looked, and he said he saw what looked like an ear, like a canine ear. That's the first thing he told me. What his exact words were, a wolf's ear, but I'm assuming canine, whatever. And so he said it looked like a wolf. And he said that it went through his mind that it could be something, but then he thought there's coy wolves. Maybe that's what it is. At that time, people didn't know what a coy wolf was. These really large coyotes that look like wolves, but now we know that they're coy wolves. They're a hybrid that have reached all the way down here to Texas. So anyway, he thought, I'm going to take a shot at this thing, but it never would come out into the clearing. So he's like, me being stupid and young, I whistled at it to see if it would respond and come out into the clearing so I could take a shot at it. And he said when he did this thing, it came out into the clearing, but it stood up on two legs. And he said literally when this thing stood out in front of him, and I asked him, I said, what was the distance from you to that thing? He said it was probably, at first he said that it was about 100 yards. That's what he said at first. And then I said 100 yards. It was that far. And then he started estimating, and he said, no, it couldn't have been about 100. It could have been about 75 yards. So I'm going to assume that it was probably a pretty good distance at that point, that he had to look at it with binoculars. Maybe that's somewhere between 75 and 100 yards. That's the best distance that he could come up with, best I could come up with. And I asked him, I said, well, you've been out to that spot before, right? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, you've been out there since? And he said no. He had never gone back out there to relive that and to see, where that, he said, I never even go to that part of the property ever. Now, this place where he was at was in the middle property. Like I said, their property is on the furthest south end of this whole tract of what used to be the Hitchens Ranch. Now, Hitchens is not their real last name. That's why but that's Shane's property. Now, that was his great-grandfather had bought that land and cleared it out. And they used it to raise cattle and sheep. Well, sheep on one side, cattle on the other. So what he told me was, it was on Noah's property. Now, Noah's property, the way it's laid out, the way they described it to me was Andrew, their dad, he had the further south property. And then there was Noah's property in the middle. And then further north and a little bit to the west was Abel's property. And then a little further west and to the north was Shane's property. Okay. Now, that's how the land was laid out. So he was technically on what was Noah's property. That was his uncle. And Noah was the oldest brother. I believe he was the oldest brother. So anyway, he was on Noah's property and he's like, I've never been back to that part of the property ever again. I never went back. He's like, I didn't go and judge the distance. So we kind of came up with a number, maybe 7,500 yards. So this thing, he said it just started to walk toward him. And he said it was so big that the sun going down in the back behind the trees, you could still see it kind of breaking through the trees. He said it blocked out the sun. And I was like, wow, that's a big creature, from where it was standing. He said, there's no, I can't even tell you how much it weighed. It was huge. It was just gigantic. And he said that from what he saw, it was a reddish brown color. Once again, that same color. And that it was coming toward him, just walking like a man, And I said, did it kind of lurch hunched over or was it walking straight? He said, no, just like a man would walk, swinging its arms sideways. He said the arms were long. And he said that his body was built like a bodybuilder. But it had a huge, gigantic wolf head on it. And I said, what about the legs? He's like, I didn't really notice the legs. At that time, he goes, it was just coming straight at me. I didn't see, I said, well, a lot of people report that they're backward bent legs. And he said he didn't notice that. So anyway, he's getting ready to leave. And then he's thinking, I don't know if I should try to get to my ATV and take off. And then this thing's going to follow me. Or should I wait till it gets closer and try to kill it? All these things are going through his mind. And when he's telling me this story, you could tell that he was reliving this account. And I asked him a couple times if he needed to stop. I said, you need to stop or whatever, and he's like, no, I'm good. And everybody was very quiet and respectful, which, these guys are always joking around and they're always messing with each other. And I knew that they were taking it seriously too. I was watching their reactions because I wanted to make sure these guys weren't pulling my leg. So he's sitting there, he's reliving this, and I could tell that it was bothering him. And so anyway, this thing's coming toward him, and he said just then he hears a hog, like a hog snorting, and he could hear little babies like piglets. And he said at that point he had started praying. And in his mind, he says he thinks it was like a miracle, like God delivered him. I mean, like he goes, I'm not kidding, Wolf. He goes, I think that God delivered me. That was his words. I mean, he believes that, and that's fine. I respect that. I don't know what I believe about that or not, but could be just a coincidence. But anyway, a sow with little piglets came out, and he said that thing, it just kneeled down. It got down on all fours like so fast, boom, and then it just kind of like started sauntering toward the edge of the clearing. And he said that at that point he thought that thing was waiting for the sow to come out to ambush it. And so he was like, you know what, this is my chance. And he said that the shed where he was sitting was like a tin shed, so that he was going to have to open the door. And he said that the thing was going to make noise. So he started to open it, and it was like, I can't do the sound effect, but he said it made a scraping noise. And he was like, oh, no, it's going to hear that, And he said that it did. It turned its head and kind of cocked its head and kind of turned it sideways. And he said that it was like sniffing the air. And he said, oh, man, this thing is it's either going to go for me or it's going to go for those hogs. And he said at that point, it sounded like the hogs were moving away. So he thought, these hogs probably got wind of it or something, and they're booking the other direction, and it's not following them. So he just made a break for his four-wheeler, and he took off. And he started it up, and he hauled butt out of there. Now, he said that there's a short trail to get back to the main road, which leads to Noah's house. Now, he was going to try and make a break for his uncle's house. Now, he said that his uncle's house was probably about a 5-minute ride. It wouldn't be that far, but he would have to cut to get there that quickly. He was going to have to cut through a pasture. And he said that there was just a cattle guard right there that goes into that particular pasture, so he could just make a break right for it. Well, the problem was that there was this Broford bull, okay, and if you know anything about bulls, Brofords are like the meanest. What it is a Hereford cow or bull that's been bred with a Brahma. And they're notoriously mean-spirited animals. They're not friendly at all. And they have a really, really nasty disposition. So anyway, he's like, I was going to have to contend with that bull. And he said, never fails. You go into that pasture, and the bull's name was Simon. That's what they told me. And he said, when you go into that pasture, Simon's he automatically just comes and he defends his territory. Now, what they told me was that bull was so mean that it had killed a younger, smaller bull. It had actually sired. So it killed its own offspring. So this thing was a vicious animal, and he wasn't kind to people going into his area, his territory. And so they had told me before that they had cattle that had been killed. That, it was a regular occurrence, and it was to the point where Shane was about to just quit messing with them. He said the only kind of cattle he could keep out there, this is what Shane had told me, was longhorns, because they were so mean and had big old horns that for whatever reason, these creatures wouldn't really mess with them. Well, if you had anything else, like any kind of cows of any kind of other hornless anything, they were going to attack it. So they had drove him out of the cattle business altogether. But this Broford bull, obviously, they had respect for it. It had never been messed with because it was so big. It was about 1,800 pounds, according to what they were telling me. And he said this thing could run, too. It was fast, which is crazy. You think about a giant animal moving that fast. Well, this thing made a beeline for him, and I see that thing coming out onto the main road, and it's following me. He's like, it is behind me. And he goes, and when I crossed over the cattle guard and I hugged I just went and I went straight to the fence line as far away as I could from Simon. And Simon was on the clear on the other side of the pasture. He came running over there to see what was up, who's in my enclosure. And he just said, I'm going to try and make it as fast as I can to the back fence. Well, he said the problem was that there were all these divots and holes in that ground where he was riding. And so he said that he was jumping and bouncing and he couldn't really go super fast. He said he was catching air a couple times and coming down on the front, and he thought he was going to flip at one point. And he's like, something's going to get me. It's either going to be the bull or it's going to be that thing. And he's going over in his mind, like, which way do I want to die? Do I want to be gored to death or do I want to be eaten? So this is going on in this kid's head. He's 17 years old. It's got to be a traumatizing experience. So he said he's trying to go as fast as he can, but he's still trying to control this ATV. And when he gets to a certain point, he sees that the bull is going to meet him at some point. And he said his only chance was to get off of that ATV and try to hop over a barbed wire fence that was reinforced with an electrical fence. So he was going to get messed up. So he was like, I can try to open the gate, but I'd have to undo it and all that. And he said that there was no way that he was going to be able to get through that. So he decided to just jump off the ATV. He said it was like he had slowed down as much as he could. He just kind of jumped and hopped up a tree. He climbed up a tree. He said there was like a mid-sized oak tree, and he climbed up it, and no sooner he got halfway up, that bull was right at the base of it. So he goes, I'm looking down, and I got this bull at the base of this tree, and he goes, I don't know what to do. And he said, and I looked off in the distance, and he goes, and I could see that thing, the way he described it, which was the dog man. And he said that it had flattened itself onto the ground, and it was like you could see its back. And you could kind of see the top of the head or whatever. And he said that it was laying down, hiding in the grass at the front of the pasture. So this thing was not going to contend with that bull. I guess it just wasn't going to do it. And he said that it just sat there. And he said this thing was big, really big. So that bull must have been really nasty for that thing to not try to even, whatever. He said that it just sat there. And he said that he sat there up in that tree and he was like, where's my phone? He pulled his phone out and his phone was dead. So there was no calling for help. There was no nothing, and he was like, I don't know what I could do. There's nothing I could do. I was just stuck. I'm just sitting in this tree. And he goes, and I had told my mom basically to pound salt. So he goes, I figured nobody was coming to look for me because, they were just going to let me do what I wanted. And he said, I kept regretting telling her, she goes, I should have just left when she called me. They kept telling me that. So anyways, he's sitting up in this tree, and he says finally it gets dark. The bull's still at the base of the tree, and that thing is still crouched down, sitting there just waiting for him. And so he figured, if this bull gets tired and moves away from the tree, then I can get out of here. I can jump the fence maybe. And then that thing's probably going to come after me. And he's like, can I make it to the house? These things are going through his head. So finally, at this point, he goes, I saw some headlights coming down the road. And that's when his brother kind of jumped in. And Jerry tells me, he goes, yeah, my mom had come and got us, and we were working on my brother's truck. And they told us to go find your little brother because it's past dark and he hadn't come in yet. And so they were worried about him. And so anyways, they were kind of aggravated by that because they were like, this little turd, he didn't listen, and now we got to go get him and stop what we're doing. So they went out there to go fetch him or whatever. But the dad wasn't there, I guess. And from what they said, their dad was in town. He was with their little sister or whatever, getting groceries, and their truck was not running. So they had to walk over to Noah's property. And when they got to the house, they told Noah what happened. They got in his old truck. They went down the dirt road, and they had a big spotlight looking for him. They looked everywhere. They went into the hollow. They didn't see him. They went all over the property. They went into Abel's property, and finally they came back down the opposite way, and that's when they saw Robbie was yelling at him, and they shined the light, and they saw the ATV sitting there. At this point, it had ran out of gas. He didn't even turn it off. He said it just ran out of gas, and that's when they pulled into the pasture. Now, Robbie tells me they should have seen this thing there on the corner of the pasture, crouched down in the grass. He goes, but they drove right by it, and they didn't see it. And none of them said that they saw it. So this thing was hiding pretty well. Robbie knew it was there, and he was yelling at him. So this thing is right there. They drive right by it, literally. And he's waving at him. There's something there, and when they pulled up, now this bull, usually there's always at least one person that can handle him. Noah had raised this bull since he was a baby, since it was a calf. So Noah told them, stay in the truck. He got out, and he got the bull to back off, and he walked it off to the other side of the pasture. And I guess he did something. I don't know. He put it somewhere. They didn't elaborate on that. But anyway, the first guy out of the truck was his oldest brother, Andre. He gets out of the truck, and he's like, come on, dude, get down. And Robbie says, there's a thing sitting there in the corner of the pasture. It chased me into this enclosure. Because they were asking him, why are you in this enclosure? And he's like, this thing is right there. And they're like, what thing? We don't see anything. So they start shining the flashlight, in that area where he's claiming that he's seeing something. And Jerry said, he goes, I was just standing there. I didn't know what to think one way or the other. But he goes, Andre decided to be, because he's always kind of like a bully. The way they described him, he's kind of a bully. So he was like, oh, whatever, dude. It's the Kukui. He's out there in the yeah, right. Okay, whatever. And he said, it's right there. And so when he gets down, he points at it and he shines the light right on it. And he goes, that's a dirt mound. And so he goes, it's a dirt mound. He starts walking toward it. And he goes, let me prove it to you. He goes, there's nothing there. So Robbie and his older, and Jerry are looking at each other. He's like, we looked at each other and kind of shrugged our shoulders like, go ahead, whatever. You're going to walk right up on it. And they're telling him, at this point, Jerry's even telling him, hey man, come on, dude. You don't know what that is. Cause like I said, he had seen one. So who knows, dude? This thing is there, So anyways, this part was really crazy. Andre gets right up to the thing about 15 yards away from it. He turns around. He goes, I don't see. This thing stands up behind him. Okay. And they're screaming, hey. And then at that point, his uncle saw it too and was like yelling at him. He's like, hey, Baboso, look behind you. And that thing is like turned around, basically one leap, went over the fence and was just not running. They said it just kind of got to the road and just kind of sauntered into the woods. And Andre turned around and saw it right when it jumped over the fence. And he said it just was one leap, boom, and it was over the fence. And this fence is not, it's about chest high. So this thing just jumped right over it and was like over, the other side of the road, And he said that Andre like tripped backwards. Literally, he tried to run and he tripped and fell backwards and like monkey rolled and dropped the flashlight, left it, whatever, and ran back to the truck. And they all scrambled to try to get into the cab, And they were telling Robbie, get in the back. And he was like, no. And they were like fighting and arguing. And Noah tells him, shut up. Let's get out of here. And so they drove out through the other pasture. They went through the back way and they drove through the bumpy pastures to get back to Noah's main house. And when they got back to the house, he said we were all just in shock. Now, Jerry said from where he was standing, the angle that he had, he said, I didn't get a good look at it. He goes, I saw something stand up and it was dark, but Andre was kind of in front of it and I was on the other side of the truck. He's like, so I didn't really get a good view. I thought I saw something go across the road. Now, Noah saw it clearly from where he was at. And I guess Robbie, of course, he saw it, and Andre turned around and saw it jump over the fence. So I guess that would be considered Jerry's like second encounter or whatever. But like he said, he didn't get a real good look at it, but he knew what it was, and they were all freaked out because that was interesting that the same color that the one that Jerry saw was what Robbie reported to me, was that it was a reddish brown color. Now I'm thinking, same creature? I don't know. But anyways, I was hoping that Jerry would have been able to elaborate if he thinks that was the same one, because the one he saw was the same color. But, like I said, he said he didn't get a good look at it. So anyway, that was Robbie's encounter. Robbie said he never had another encounter beyond that, but I'm sure that's enough for anybody. I don't think he's going to want to have another. And he said he wasn't going back out to Noah's property for nothing. So that was the end of that. So anyways, the other encounter that I was going to talk about, now this was their neighbor Shane. Now Shane is there, and he's a real country dude. So I'm going to try to use my own words to describe what happened to him. Now his encounter involved him being on horseback. Now that was really interesting to me. And I said, now what happened to you? And that's when I just kind of went around the horn and I said, hey, can you tell me? And he's like, well, what happened to me? He's like, first of all, he said, these things have been on my property for a long time. So he had heard stories about them, from all the way back to his grandfather and his great aunt had an encounter. And he said, now this is what happened to me. Now he claims that he was on, and like I said, this is their stories, not mine. I'm not, if you think these are lies, it's, this is what they told me. Okay. I can't testify to the veracity of this because I was not a witness to any of these events. All right. So don't shoot the messenger, but this is what he said. Now, this story is really crazy. Like, he said that he was on horseback one day with his wife, and the horse that she was on began to rear and kind of buck a little bit, and it was like they were on this trail. Now, the trail they were on is like literally the boundary between Abel's property and his. Now, like I said, Abel's property is the furthest north of the brothers, of the Hernandez family brother. Not their real name, but anyways. What Shane told me was that her horse kind of started to rear, and he said, we have several horses. And he said that had never happened before, and he thought a snake, so he looked down, he didn't see anything, and the horse just wouldn't go any further, and it started getting real ornery. So he said, you know what? Let's just go back in, so they took the horses back in and they put them back in the corral, whatever. And they put them back up in the barn. And he said that was just unusual. That had never happened before. So he said he thought that there might have been something there. Now, he said a few days after that, he went out for a trot around the property on his horse, the same one he had that same day, that didn't react the way the other horse had. Now, he said this was a really seasoned mare. He'd been on this horse a lot, and he was out for a trot with that horse and checking his property. He said he got around to that same spot in the trail, and his horse started to act kind of funny and whatever, and he was like, whoa. And he thought, man, this is crazy. This is the same spot where I was at last time. Now, he said at this point, he heard something. He heard like footfall, twigs snapping and breaking. In the tree line that was right there, there's like a ditch. He said there was like a ditch right there, and there was a tree line. He heard twigs and things snapping and breaking, and he thought, what the heck is that? And he looks down, and he sees this thing, what he thought was a giant wolf, walking along the tree line or whatever, and he thought, man, that is weird. What is that? And it's paralleling him and the horse. At this point, the horse wanted nothing to do with it. It wanted to head back to the stable, obviously. So it bucked. He stayed on it, and it bucked, and it threw him off. And he said after a couple of those, it just threw him off, and it was gone. And he said it took off the other side down there's a little embankment, he said there, and then it goes up a little bit, and then there's like the barbed wire fence to Abel's property. And he said that it just jumped onto that fence to try to get over the fence to get back toward the stables. And he said it jumped over the fence and got hung up. And he said at that point, when a horse runs away, they usually run in the direction of where they stable. But this thing was, like his first reaction was just trying to go back to the stables. No, this thing was just trying to get away. because it was going toward Abel's property, not the other direction, which is where they live, which it would have had to go down and around this tree line. So this thing was panic. It was just sheer panic, you know. So anyway, whatever it was had scared the living crud out of this horse. It had jumped and it caught its leg on the barbed wire. This thing came bounding out of the tree line. Now, like I told you on the pre-interview, Vic, that's not the words he used. He used another word. It was like, I don't know. But anyways, it came bound, in my words, not his. It bounded out onto the road. He said it just kind of sat there like a football player, just staring at him like it was going to form tackle him. And he said he was laying on the ground and he thought maybe he had hurt his tailbone. You know, he felt like it had broken something. He did have a pistol. Now, he said he had a big old .357 pistol. And he said that he pulled it out and he was getting ready to take a shot at this thing and it went toward the horse. And he said he kind of paused for a second and then he unloaded several rounds. He stood up and he was still kind of in shock and he was walking backwards. And he said that from what he saw, the thing had stopped. The horse had gotten loose and was running across the pasture into Abel's property. And he said that this thing stopped when he fired the shots. Now, he don't know if he hit it or not, but he said he fired several rounds and it all happened so fast it was like a blur, in his words. And he said that he leveled the gun at it, and when he did, it crouched down and was snarling and growling and snapping, but it didn't lunge at him. And he said he had his boot was halfway off and he was trying to get his foot in his boot. Now, when he was telling me this story, he was very animated and he was giving me all these physical gestures and I could get into what he was saying. You know what I mean? At one point, he even kind of was like on the ground, like showing me, you know. So anyway, this guy's giving me this real descriptive physical description of what was going on. I wish I could relay it the way he was telling me, but I'm doing the best I can. And he said that he was trying to get his boot on, you know, and he said that, you know, his arm was all skinned up and he had rocks in his arm, whatever. And he leveled his gun at this thing again to try to, because it was creeping toward him. And he said that it would start to stand up. He would point the gun at it and it would get back down. So that tells me that this thing is cognizant of what that gun is, what it's capable of, what it does. It knew that this thing produces pain, you know? So anyway, his words were, this knew what a gun was. You know, it knew what my pistol was. And so he's like, I'm backing up. And finally I just take off running. And he said that he looked back and the thing didn't follow him. Like it didn't come bounding down the road at him. He said it didn't follow him at all. And he ran and he said that the closest to property that he was Abel's house. So he ran over to Abel's house and was like banging on the door like, hey, you know, and he said that they took him to the hospital. He had a hairline fracture in his lower back, a couple vertebrae, whatever. I think he said he broke a couple toes and his arm was all tore up. But he said when the horse got back to the stable, it made its way back to the house. Horses are smart. They know where to go. That his wife said that the back leg was all tore up. Poor thing was just, it had ripped the leg up pretty bad. Apparently, though, she recovered. Now, here's what's really interesting. He said he didn't see this thing attack the horse. But like he said, it happened so fast, it was like a blur. But there was a really long gash on the right flank of the horse, which would have been the opposite of the way that the horse was facing him from what he was telling me. He don't know how that got there. He said unless this thing was just lightning fast enough to like take a swipe at it and he didn't see it, and then it got back onto the road when he started firing. Because when he said he started shooting, it was just, that was it. It just, you know, that thing was focused on him. So anyways, this incident he told me about, and I asked him, I said, were there any other incidents involving you? Did anything else happen? He said, no. He said, now my little brother Cody, he has about 10 acres that are basically on the Hitchens property. The way they described Cody, and I ain't met the kid, that's the youngest brother, and he's got another brother that lives in Giddings. But the way that it was described to me by the Hernandez brothers and by Shane was that he's kind of a hardhead and that he apparently has seen these things 3 different times. But one time with his wife, they went out to check because the chickens had been getting harassed and they heard all this noise, and that he saw one. This is the only story that they relayed to me that was about Cody, the younger brother of Shane. And like I said, he lives in a little bottom right there that's literally on Shane's property. You know, he just kind of gave him a spot or whatever. So anyway, he said that his little brother had gone out there, and he said the way they've described him is he's kind of a hardhead. So he goes out there and he said that this thing was sitting there by the chicken coop chowing down on chickens and eggs. And it lifted up its head and it had egg yolk on its face. So it was eating eggs, and I guess it killed all the chickens. And so he was just infuriated. So Cody, instead of being afraid, like most people would be like, holy crap, his wife freaks out and she runs back to the house. He runs back in there and he's like, I'm going to kill this. So he goes in there and he grabs his 22-250 or whatever and runs. Well, that's, a deer rifle. They said a deer rifle. I'm assuming that's what it was. I don't know. But anyway, he runs back out, and he's going to shoot it. At that point, I told Shane, I said, is this kid crazy? Is he got a mental problem? And they're all kind of like, yeah, he's kind of stupid. And I'm just like, that is insane. Like, I would not go back out and try to shoot something that's just right. It'd just, slaughtered your animals. I understand. And he's angry. But after what these things had reportedly done to these other guys, and I asked him if Cody gave him a description of it, and he said from what he was told, and he had told him and Jerry, both of them, that its fur was gray. And he remembers that. He said it looked just like a timber wolf. That's weird. And he said, but it had these weird backward bent legs, and it was crouched down, and it had weird looking hands. That tells me, yeah, that's the telltale signs of a dog man, and that's probably what it was. But that the fur was a different color altogether, not the reddish brown color of the ones that they had encountered. This one was gray. So to me, there's definitely a population there. In my mind, that's what I'm thinking. There's a population there. It's not just one critter that's running around terrorizing these people. It's more than one. Now, there's another story that was told to me when I pushed him a little further. I told Shane, I said, you said that there were some stories growing up that you had heard. He said, well, one of the funniest ones in particular was there was a door-to-door salesman that had come out onto the property to sell, I guess, tractor supplies or something. I guess back in the day, these people would go door to door and they would try to get these country folk to buy stuff. I don't know. Anyway, he said it was a salesman, and he said he came hauling up the gravel road to the house. Now, this happened on his Aunt Myrtle's property, which is now part of, I guess, the north part of the Hitchens property. That's where her place was. But that would be his grandfather's sister, from what he told me. And she had a husband that lived on the property. And apparently, he wasn't a very nice guy. He was a drunk, and he had beat her, and he was pretty mean. And ultimately, he disappeared. Apparently, like he went out one day and just never came back. And they don't know what happened to him. Now, who knows? I know that he had mentioned that his grandfather and them didn't like the guy. And then, of course, there was an investigation. They never found a body. Maybe the dog men got him. I don't know the whole story, but I know that one time this salesman came up the road and he was honking the horn, and they come out and they're like, who is this guy? What do you want? This is broad daylight. And the guy says, I was going to try and sell you some supplies, but I just would like an escort off of your property. And he's like, what are you talking about? He goes, when I drove through, I just saw something run across the road that looked like it weighed 800 pounds and it was hairy. Can you please just get me off this property? And so the dude was like, they're looking at each other like, is this guy crazy? Well, the thing was, his Aunt Myrtle had told her husband that she had had a problem when she was younger, that she had seen these things. And apparently this uncle of theirs this guy she had married, he had seen them too, but he was like one of those people that was in denial about it. And he had all kinds of explanations about it, like people that have, there'll be a haunting or something, and one person will be like, well, I saw this, and the other person's like, I just saw shadows. I don't know what that was. You know what I mean? So apparently, I guess from what I could deduce, that's what this guy was just a diehard. He wasn't gonna, and like I said, he drank and he hit her, so who knows what kind of person he was other than just a villain, I guess. So anyways, he told the guy, he's like, well, I ain't gonna do for you, and she's like, oh, come on, Hank, or whatever, whatever his name was, something like that. And she's like, just give him an escort out of here. So he got in his truck and followed him out, and they just thought that was crazy. So she told him, her husband, that they had stuff going on that property since she was a girl. Now, the one story that sticks out in the mind of Shane, what he told me was his Aunt Myrtle had told him that one day she was out chopping firewood with her brother being his grandfather. Now, he said that when she was out there chopping the firewood or whatever, that the brother I guess his grandfather, and this was a story that was relayed to him by his great aunt, that her brother, his grandfather, his name is Amos, grabbed her and said, let's go inside now. And she was like, why? What? And she said, don't look back, just let's go. He started pushing her, and she's like, stop pushing me. She's getting upset. and he just yanks her and starts pulling her in. And she said this was back during the Depression, so I'm assuming like in the 30s. She looked back, she turned around, and just then her dog, their little dog, had run up and was confronting this creature, and it just opened its mouth. She said it had the biggest mouth that she had ever seen of any creature in any book, and it just reached down and grabbed the dog and just snapped, and all she heard was a crunching pop and a yelp, and then it was over. I guess the dog was covering their retreat, and it paid for it with its life. And he said that really had an effect on her. That when she told that story, she had tears in her eyes, and she was telling, she's like, that's why I don't want you youngins out there after dark. And that's why we don't go out after dark. So that was a very telling story for him. Obviously, Shayna had an effect on him. But like I said, he only had the one encounter. He'd never seen these things. They're pretty elusive, and they were all pretty much in agreement that they're not around during certain times of the year. So I don't know if these things are seasonal. Maybe they hibernate during the summer. I'm trying to figure out that myself. But they said that most of the time, the encounters they had were in the fall, anytime in the late fall to early spring. And that's when they would see them. And throughout the winter, they would see them. So these things aren't hiding out in the winter. They're roaming around. And he said the cowboys that had worked for his grandfather when his spread got really big, the grandfather was the son of the guy that founded it, I guess, and that would be Shane's great-grandfather. And, of course, Abel, Noah, and Andrew, their father, he worked for the great-grandfather or whatever. So, anyways, I guess when he was a young man, he came to work for him. And I guess he was from Mexico originally, and he was a vaquero down in Mexico. So he took a job there, his first job he could get. And there were several other Mexicans that had come over because at that time they were telling me that there was something going on down there. There was some kind of war or something. So they all came up here to work, and they went to work for his great-grandfather. This stuff had been happening for a long time. And from what they were telling me, some of these vaqueros back in the day would see these things, roaming around the property, and they would take shots at them. And so I'm thinking they probably shot at them pretty regularly, and these things would just kind of run away because they knew what these things were capable of. So, that could have been either a learned trait that was passed down for these creatures to know what that gun was that Shane had. Because I thought that immediately when he said that they would take shots at him all the time, and that they had a bunkhouse. And now they told me that there was this old, it's run down now, but there was a bunkhouse where the vaqueros stayed at that was to the far west of the property. And that one night these things attacked the bunkhouse and that they were shooting at them. And they didn't go into detail. They didn't know a lot of details. They just heard this story passed down from the older generation. He also said that his grandfather at one time, he said that there was a big hole with like a tunnel that led down into the ground, kind of at an angle, and they covered it up. And he said that after they did that, it seemed like there was a spike in the activity, like a lot of sightings were taking place out there. And I'm sure that if I could ever talk to these older gentlemen, the uncles of these people, I could probably glean some really good information from them about this, but I don't have access to that, and I didn't ask. But anyway, those are the little side stories that I was told about this property and what had gone on there. And now the last encounter of this family, of the Hernandez family, was a brother. That's Jojo. Now, he's a real character. I like him. He's a good dude. I really like him a lot. He's funny. He was kind of the black sheep. He was the youngest of the four brothers. Abel, Noah, and Andre are his older brothers. Now, Jojo, he's kind of a joker, man. He likes to joke around. He's all tattooed up. Now, he did a stint in prison. He was in prison for a few years. He had gotten in trouble and did some time. So he liked to ride motorcycles. He didn't live out on the property. He moved and got married young and all this other stuff. But once he got out of the joint, in his words, he said, I cleaned up, I went back to God, and I went to work for my nephew, and I've been doing it ever since. Now, I've talked to him on several occasions, and I talked to him before I even knew that he was Jerry's uncle. So, anyway, he was working on the crew with Robbie over at the other property. So he was there that night. We were sitting there talking because we all kind of met that night, and I had bought them food. So I kind of was bribing them, tell me these stories. So anyway, we're sitting there and we're talking, and now this guy, Jojo, he goes, I have a story, but I don't want to talk about it. And I said, come on, man. And they all kind of started razzing him. They're like, oh, yeah, you're the guy that was going to knock it out and all this other stuff. And he's like, yeah, it happened. What happened, and he didn't want to tell me. And I said, come on, man. Everybody else has told me their story. I want to hear your encounter. And he said, well, mine didn't happen on the ranch.
He's like, and I nearly died. And I'm going like, well, it sounded like Robbie nearly died too. You know, it sounded like Shane nearly died. So what makes you different, you know? And he's like, yeah, but man, you know, mine was bad. You know, it was really bad, dude. And I was just like, well, everybody's is the worst because it happened to them. You know what I mean? So we're sitting here talking and he says, well, this happened to me at a property. Now I'm going to call this the Lowry place. Now these were people that lived in town and they decided they were going to build a house out in the country. Apparently this guy was somebody that they knew from school, that they had gone to school with. They all knew. They played football together. Anyway, we're going to call it the Lowry place. I'm not going to give you the last name because I don't know these people at all. This is secondhand from somebody else. So anyways, they were installing the cabinets for them. They had built a big old house right there about 5 miles out of town. And he said it was literally about 2 or 3 miles up the road from Shane's place. So it's close to the same area. You know, it's the same area. I doubt these things respect any boundaries. I'm sure that they probably roam around that whole region. I doubt that they're like, oh, this is somebody's property, I'm going to stay here. No, they move around. So it makes sense that this would happen. But anyways, he didn't believe any of the stories. He always thought it was just a bunch of mentiras, as he would say. So he said that, you know, I never bought into that. I always thought it was a bunch of bull crap. He goes, but I was working late one night and my partner, my carnal, he had left, you know, he was gone. And he said, I decided to stay late so I could try to finish up. I wanted to knock this job out. Plus, he said he wanted to do a good job. They were good friends. You know, they were friends of mine. I wanted to do a good job, you know. And so I'm staying back and I'm working late. He's like, I called my wife and I said, I'm going to be home late. I'm going to stay here and try to finish this job. Well, he said that it got to be his exact time frame was, he said that it was close to midnight. So he had been there pretty late. And he said that he thought at one point, he thought he had seen something move towards one of the back windows earlier, right after dusk. But he's like, my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then he said around midnight, he said he clearly saw something move by one of the windows near the kitchen where he was working. And he said, oh no, at that point, he goes, I knew I saw something. And so this thing was lurking around, you know. And he said he turned the music off and he sat there for a minute just frozen like, what am I going to do? What the heck am I going to do? And he said all these thoughts were going through my mind like maybe this is what these people were talking about. And then he said maybe it's a Bigfoot. You know, he said it was obviously on 2 legs. So he didn't know what it was, but he knows he saw it. But he didn't get a good look at it because the lights were on the inside and it was pitch dark outside. So he says he walked to the front door and he locked it just because his instinct just to lock the door. And then he said just then he heard something walk up onto the step right there in front of the front door. And at this point, he's like, whoa, am I imagining this? Is this really happening? I know how that feeling is, having had my own encounter. You're thinking that at first, like, what is this? When he was telling me, it was the same thing when Robert was telling me his story. It was like, it was an emotional ride for him. You know what I mean? I could see it and everybody was quiet and we were listening. When everybody would tell their side of whatever happened, everybody was trying to be respectful. There wasn't anybody joking around and playing around, and that's what I'm saying. These guys always do that. They like to razz people. But they weren't joking. There was no chuckle house here. This guy was telling his story, and he said that something was at the door, and he looked out the peephole, and he goes, and I turned the porch light on. He's like, I didn't see anything. I just saw black. And he said that that's not correct, because with the porch light on, he should have been able to see his truck. He said his truck wasn't but like 10, 12 yards from the house where he was parked right there, you know. So anyways, he says he sees nothing but black, and he says then he hears something kind of sliding against the door. He said it sounded almost like cloth, you know, moving against the door. And he said that he was like, oh. So he backed up, and he looked at the peephole again, and he just sees blackness. And so at that point, he said he knew that something was there, and there was no doubt in his mind. He backed up, and he said he freaked out. And he said that this thing kind of bumped against the door again, and he heard a grunt. Then he said that at that point, he noticed the door to the garage was wide open, and the garage door was wide open. So he looks out. He doesn't see anything out in the driveway. So he closes the door, and he locks it for what good that was going to do him. So he says, I'm standing there, and I'm frozen. He goes, I don't know what to do. He goes, and I had a gun, but it was in the truck. He said, then he heard something in the garage, and he was like, oh, no, this thing is in the garage. And he's telling me this, and he's like, I don't know what to do, man. I'm frozen. I don't know what to do.
And he said that, it's going through his mind that he goes, what a fool that I was, to believe that I could deal with something like this. He's like, I was terrified, dude. I mean, he goes, I ain't gonna lie, I was terrified. And so he said he was standing there and he heard it sniffing around and growling, like a grunting, growling noise. And he said that it banged up against the door to the garage, like it went straight for the door. The doorknob kind of moved a little bit. He said it jiggled. Now I said, did it turn? Did it turn it, or did it kind of just jiggle it? And he said, because I've talked to people who had said that that they turned the doorknob, you know what I mean? And he said, no, it didn't turn, what I noticed, but I'm pretty sure it just kind of jiggled it. And he goes, but then again, I was so scared. So who knows? So anyways, he books out the front door. He just makes a split-second decision. He's going to bail. He's going to head for his truck because this thing bangs on the door again. And at this point, it was cracked. The door was cracking. So he ran out the front door. He said that he turned and the garage was right there. He looked into the garage because he heard a loud bang, pop, crack. And the thing had, I guess, it had gotten into the house. So he said that he pulled the emergency latch, I guess, for the garage door to pull it down, I don't know exactly how that works or whatever, but he said he pulled the garage door down just so if it tries to come back out, it would have to contend with the door. Maybe it couldn't open it, lift it the way, that we do. And I thought that's smart that he did that, Anyways, he made a break for his truck and he said, I didn't have one of those trucks with the boop boop. They just let you get in it. He's like, I had an old truck and I was trying to put the key in the hole. And he says, I literally was dropping my keys, dude. He goes, you would not believe. He goes, you see that happen in these movies. The way he says it is really funny. He's like, you see these pendejos doing it in the movies and you're like, why are you doing that, pendejo? And then he said that it was happening to him and he was just like so scared and so nervous. He said he finally got in, he got the truck, he got in and he was like, my pistol's right here. He reaches down, he grabs it and he's like, this thing comes running out after me. I'm going to shoot it. I got my gun right here, And he says that he's like sitting there thinking, maybe I should call the police because he didn't, when he was inside the house, he had told me that he had no bars. And he told me that at the beginning of the story. He goes, because I asked him, I said, do you have a cell phone? He said, no, it didn't have any signal out there. He goes, it didn't have any bars. And he's like, dude, he goes, I was mad. He's like, and I'm thinking, I'm immediately starting to drive down the road and I'm looking back and I'm, I was going to look for my phone. And I realized I left it in the house. So when I could get a signal, I left it on the counter or whatever. And, so he was freaked out. He looks back. Now, this is what he told me. Well, this part sounds kind of incredible, but this is what I was told. But he looked back and that this thing was looking out the glass panel of the garage door. And he said that, and I asked him, I said, what did it look like? He said it looked like a big old bear with a wolf's head. That's all I could describe, like a bear wolf mix. And I said, what color was it? He said it was black. He said it was black, jet black, like just black as night. It's solid black. And I said, and I asked him, I said, were you sure it was just solid? He goes, no, it was just solid black. He says he hears a crash. He looks back. And this thing is reaching through the panel with its hand kind of moving around down below the, like reaching down. You could see the arm coming out of the window. That was really interesting to me. So I asked him, I said, what did it look like? What did the arm look like? And he said it was just black, covered with hair, just like the face, and he said, but it had this weird looking paw hands. Now, I asked him to describe that. He said, I didn't look back a second time. He goes, I was gone. And he's like, and I got my gun right there in my hand and I'm driving down the road all crazy, and he's thinking, if this thing comes running alongside his truck, he's going to shoot it, he's going to start firing at it, and he just kept thinking that's what was going to happen. So he's hauling, he gets to this convenience store, I guess, right down the road, a few miles, whatever. He stops. He says, I had to just sit there in the parking lot and process what had just happened. And he's like, he goes, I literally broke down in tears. He goes, I couldn't believe what had just happened to me. He goes, I thought there's no way that just happened to me. He goes, I just was stunned. He goes, I had always made fun of these people. And at that point, his nephews were kind of laughing at him and Shane was laughing at him. And he was like, I'm sorry. And I thought he was kind of tearing up at the time, but he's kind of a big guy. He's like, I'm like a machismo, and so I was thinking, he's not going to start crying right now, but he didn't. He held his composure and he was like, I was wrong. These things exist. I can't believe what I saw.
And he goes, but I'm telling you, and he looked me in my eye and he said, Wolf, I'm telling you the absolute truth. There is no lie right here. I'm telling you what I saw. That is what happened to me. And then, I looked at everybody. They were kind of nodding their head and I was like, okay. I mean, you say that's what happened, He said, anyways, he goes, I get home and I'm telling my wife about it. I'm frantically telling her about it. He goes, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know, he said, I told my wife and she was just like in shock. She was like, she had heard the stories too from my family. Neither one of us really believed it, but he goes, I told her, I said, babe, look, this is real. This, I'm not kidding. He's like, luckily I had the pistol with me in the truck. So if that thing came out, I was going to start shooting it. And he said that she was like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. She's like, the other day when I had the kids with me, I unloaded your gun and I put the bullets in the glove compartment. And he was like, what? And he was so frantic that he didn't even notice that there was no ammunition in the gun. So that peace of mind that he had by getting in the vehicle and thinking he had a pistol, which might not have done any good anyway. But I guess if you're driving and you're taking pot shots at it, maybe it would slow it down. I don't know. But there wasn't even any bullets in the gun. And he was just like, he goes, dude, I almost fainted. I was just like, man. And then he's like, at first, he goes, I don't think she believed what I was telling her. He goes, because she said, let's go get your phone. And he's like, no, we're not going back. Do not go there. We're not going back to that place. So he said the next day, the Lowrys came in and they were like, what the hell happened? He had left them a message, told them to give him a call. And they went back to take a look at the damage that this thing had done. And he said that he didn't know if these people really believed him, but that he didn't give a shit at that point. He was like, I don't care. And he said, I didn't give a, he goes, I wasn't going back to that place. He's like, and when we went, he goes, I went back, but I stayed out in the truck. I didn't even get out. And he said that my brother and my nephew, and they went in, they talked to him. Now, this is what Jerry told me. Now he told me, that's the nephew. He told me that he saw the damage this thing did. The garage door was bowed out and just literally like broken in half. Now, if you can just, I don't know how that would look. I tried to wrap my mind around that and wondered, like, how does a garage bent at a V, like, the way he said, and which to me would be like, at an angle, a 90-degree angle, I guess. I don't know. He said that it was bowed out and snapped. That the door from the garage going into the dining room or whatever, the entry room, I said dining room because I don't know exactly. I'm trying to make, my mind. He said that the door going into that entry room, that the door was cracked in the middle and broken off the hinges and that the paneling was busted out. The initial reaction from the Lowrys was like, this dude got high on some paint or something and he must have did this. But how did he do this? And so obviously he didn't do it. That was the linchpin. But what sold them on his story was the fact that there was a huge gash. Now I told you about this, Vic. There was a huge gash running along the little hallway when you first walk in. Javier said when you first walk in, the hallway is right there in the garage. That wall on the other side of the drywall is the garage. He said there was a huge 2-inch gash there cutting through the drywall. And that this thing had run its claws along that, apparently. And they didn't know how to explain that. And they were just like, what the? And then they said that there was a puddle of piss in the kitchen. And it just smelled horrible. Now that, I don't know what that was all about, why it does these things it does, or why it did that. I have no freaking clue. I mean, all I know is what they told me. This is what happened. This is what they say happened. So that's those stories from the Hernandez family, and that's the stories from Shane's family. So that's that, as they say.
You really have to feel for the guy. That sounds like something straight out of a horror movie. I can't even imagine what that would have been like.
Oh, no, me neither. Because my encounter, I don't want to say it wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't like in a hurry to come in and destroy me. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't inside of a house being assaulted. You know what I mean? It wasn't the same as that. It was traumatic for me. I don't even know what this guy could have gone through. And like, he was in prison for a few years and
He was in what they call the Terrell unit up in North Texas. Now that's a bad place. And I had a buddy that was in there. And at one time, back around the time he was there, people were getting stabbed and they had rioted or whatever, some junk had gone on. And I could imagine this guy had gone through some pretty serious stuff, but nothing like that. And he told me that was hands down the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to him in his life. And he said that, after that, he don't work after dark anymore. And there's this guy, he's a real cool dude. He's an electrician and he's always up there in those houses working it, and sometimes he'll work after dark. And he said his name and he said, like this guy over here, he goes, I'm not going to do that. He goes, I will not work after dark. And he goes, all these companies we work for, they know we don't work after dark. It is not going to happen, dude. And I told him, and I was kind of getting nervous because these guys were about to leave and I was going to be there by myself for another 4 hours. And we're out on the edge of town. We're outside of Buda, which is outside of Austin, which is boonies. And so I'm sitting there and I'm going like, well, that's great. These guys are about to leave and I'm going to have to sit here with my imagination running wild, thinking, everything I see is a dog man. And like I said, I'm 6 foot, almost 6'4", and I weigh 400 pounds and I'm very muscular. I'm a big dude. I mean, I'm a fighter. I've always been a fighter, but I've never kidded myself into believing that I could fight one of these things or that I would have any chance at all. And I can't even imagine what that kid Cody, like how ridiculous that was. Just run back out there and try to shoot that thing. I was just like, man, I can understand Shane like trying to shoot at it to get away because he was fighting for his life. But that kid going back out there to confront it, like, it ate some eggs and some chicken. Who cares, dude? Like, you're alive. You know what I mean? And the thing is, like we had talked about, Vic, I mean, there's people that will tell me, hey, let's go out to that church out there. My buddy Armando, he's always like, he's kind of an amateur researcher like me. He wants to research this. He wants to go out there and visit with these people on the ranch. I told him I could introduce them to them if they're willing to talk to them. They could tell him the stories, whatever. But I am not, under no circumstances, going to go out on location. And I think that these people that do go on location and investigate this stuff and are tromping around out in the woods going, hey, yo, doing all that. I see them doing it. And some of these guys I've corresponded with and I respect them, some of them, but I think they're crazy. And I think the only reason that they're doing that is because they're trying to believe it themselves because they haven't seen it. Now, if you've seen it and this thing is in your face and it is absolutely there, it is a tangible corporeal being and it's there. There is no more in your lifetime, if you're a normal, sane person, going hunting and I'm not saying that people that come out and they talk about this, that they're lying, but I always find it hard to just wrap my mind around somebody that's like, I still go out in the woods all the time. I've seen them 3 times and I'm willing to go back out there. And I'm like, what? What are these people? That just either you are the bravest person that I know, or you're just not grasping the gravity of the situation. I don't know how to describe that, Vic. I mean, I can't wrap my mind around it. After what happened to me, the rest of my life, it's been no hunting, no hiking. I don't really even like sitting posts out on the edge of town, but I do it because I have to. This company was paying us 2,000 hours at $19 an hour. Yeah, you got to do what you got to do, but I'm not going to do it for the fun of it. I'm not going to do it because it seems cool or I want to know because I already know. So when somebody tells me their stories, and like I said, I've been told a lot of stories. I had a girl that told me a story she was from Serbia. We had talked about that, but it seemed like it was more of like a phantom type entity. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. It just seemed really like it was crazy. And plus this person was messaging me. I wasn't listening to her tell me, and I wasn't able to look at these people, look at her in the eye like I did these people, and they were being very descriptive with their hands and telling me the story. And that's why I believe it, because, none of them were laughing and making fun. It was serious business. When they decided to tell me everything, it was like, this is what happened. And then they took off, and it was like, well, see you later. Hate to be you by yourself out here in the woods. Yeah. I actually had the guy come in early that night for me. I did. I called him up and I was like, where are you at? He's like, I'm not up to be there for 2 hours. I said, come on, get in here and relieve me. I'm not a coward. Vic, I'm not a coward. I'm not. But I know what you're up against.
After having been in this for some time, Josh, I've come to the conclusion that you can't really rule out the possibility of someone doing something just because it doesn't make sense. I don't understand why he would go back out, but maybe to him it made good sense. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. There was one other encounter. The guy's name is Jaime. He works for that company, but this was unrelated to the Hernandez family or Shane's family. This was completely a separate incident, and I was told this encounter way back in the winter. Would you like me to tell that story too?
Please do.
Okay. This is the last one I have, and then that's it. Sorry, folks. Unless I can get any more information from these people, which I do plan to do. I am going to try and maybe sit down with their uncles, and I hope that they can give me some information from the old days, because if they can give me some stuff, then I would love to come back on, Vic, and dump some more information on you. And like I said, me and my friend Mondo, we're planning on maybe interviewing them together, maybe talking to them, doing something, and then maybe we could relay that information to you. And if anybody that's listening, Vic is where I'm going to go. If I have some information to tell or whatever, I'm going to be on Vic's show. So don't look for me to be anywhere else. That's where I'm going to go. I'm loyal, Vic. We've talked about that. I'm going to give you my stories. But for now, all I have is one more little morsel to tell you guys, and it's a good one. But this is a little different. Now, the guy didn't actually see it, but I believe that it was a dog man, and you, the listener, you can make up your own mind about it. If you don't believe me, don't believe me. Like I said, this is something that was told to me. Now, I do have another witness that's actually here with me that heard this story be recounted by the man. So whatever you want to think, you can believe it or you cannot believe it. Okay, so this guy's name is Jaime, not his real name. I'm going to call him that. He's a concrete contractor that works for that same company, but this is on a different site that's a lot further north, and it's closer to town near the airport, out near Del Valle. I'll just give you that much information. I'm not going to tell you where, but it's near a subdivision that they're building all kinds of stuff. Austin is just blowing up, 120 people moving here today. It's crazy. So anyway, this guy, he's really cool. He came in every morning. He was always really friendly, and he would bring me coffee, and we'd shoot the bull, whatever. And I noticed a pattern. You know, my grandmother was very big in details, and she used to tell me that women pay attention to details. And if you know details, and you can really get a girl, because most men don't. That kind of stuck with me, you know, my attention to detail. I always try to remember details. So I noticed that about this guy, that he would always park right by the light, and he would walk way down the road to where I was at and talk to me. So I would pull up by the house every morning, and he started to park right there by me. The job site was huge, and he would park way on the other end. He wouldn't park over there where the work was being done. And then he would wait until his crew showed up, and then he would go with them. And I always noticed that. And then I also noticed that when he used the Porta-John, he only used the one that was in front of the model home where the camera was, where the office was. You know, he would never use those ones. And like I said, he wouldn't park over there. He would park right there where he could see me and I could see him. And I always thought that was kind of unusual. And I am kind of a nosy person, I guess. You know, I do security. I have to be. So I asked him, I said, Jaime, this is, like I said, not his real name. But I asked him, I said, why do you always park right over there? Why do you always go to that bathroom when the work is on the other side, man? And he's like, why are you worried about it? You know, he's kind of joking with me, you know. And I said, I'm just curious. I mean, it's like you're scared of the boogeyman or something. And he goes, maybe I am. And he kind of said it like that. And then I thought, oh, you know what? Maybe I made this guy mad. So I kind of backed off a little bit. I said, hey, man, I'm just kidding, dude. I'm just kidding. And he goes, no, it's all right. You know, he goes, I have my reasons. And I was like, didn't want to push it at that point, you know, so I waited next day, very next day, same thing. And I saw him go to the bathroom. So I told him, I said, dude, did something happen to you? Be honest with me, man. I mean, would you tell me if something did? And he's like, yeah, but if I tell you this, what happened to me, you wouldn't believe it. And I said, try me. And like I said, I've talked to lots of people about a lot of different paranormal stuff. I've had people tell me that they thought that their house was haunted. They've seen demons. They've seen this. They've seen that. But my ears always perk up if somebody gives me a story that can even be misconstrued as a dog man. I want to know. So this guy tells me, he says, one time I was working near Vernon. That's way up in North Texas. And he said, I was on a job site and there was nothing but woods everywhere. And I always show up early. You know that. I said, yeah. And he said, so I showed up early before my crew. I went to the Porta-John. I had to take a number 2, you know. He goes in there to use the bathroom, and he said that he hears footfall, or like footsteps, I should say, what he said. Twigs breaking, whatever. He said, I heard crunching. That was his words. Coming out of the woods. It went right up to the Porta-John. And he said he could hear it kind of moving against the Porta-John in the back of it and then sniffing around. He could hear it like sniffing. He thought it was a dog. And he's like, whoa, that's a big dog. Because he said it kind of bumped the Porta-John and he felt it. Then he said that he felt something push against it on the right side of his right side of the Porta-John was being pushed. And he said, we came off the hinges. We came off the foundation. And I'm like, but I guess he's describing him in the Porta-John. And then he said that this thing went around to the other side and it kind of slid around. You could hear it and it was sniffing. And he said, dude, he goes, I was terrified. I didn't know what this was. And then he said that it bumped the other side of the Porta-John and it lifted it off the foundation. He was saying hinges, but that's not correct. It was the foundation of it. And then he said, I was scared. Literally, I couldn't poop. You know, I was just sitting there, you know, and he goes, I thought, dude, and I look at my watch and he's like, dude, it's 30 minutes before the next guy comes in and I'm stuck. This thing is here. And then he said that finally it like rammed the back of it. And he said that he tumped forward and then that literally when he did, it went forward and then lurched back. He fell forward and he hit his head and he got that blue water all over him. He said, man, you know, I was so scared. You know, I didn't know what this thing was or what it was doing or why it was doing it. And he said, I just laid there on the floor of the Porta-John covered in pee and poop. I didn't know what to do. Not his word, but my word. I'm trying to clean it up a little bit. He said he just laid there on the floor of the Porta-John and that this thing, whatever it was, just continued to walk around and bump it. And he was like, the thought that came to my mind was like, you know, I had a buddy, my friend Keith, who used to like to go out kayaking, and I thought he was crazy. But he said he had an encounter with a really large shark one time and that it was bumping his canoe and trying to tump him over. He was over there in the bay near San Francisco, which he said he could literally see the city from where he was at. And he said it was horrifying just to think that this big old shark was out there trying to kill him. Well, that's what it reminded me of. When this guy was telling me the story, I'm thinking of like, this thing is bumping. It's trying to get him out. It knows he's in there. It smells him and it wants him out. And now he said that he just laid there and finally it just stopped. It just went away. He heard it kind of walking away. Obviously it wasn't cognizant enough to try to open it. Of course, he had locked it. But this thing, whatever it was, wanted him out of that Porta-John that was kind of protecting him, I guess, which I'm surprised. I mean, it didn't just knock it over and then collapse it. But like I said, they didn't think to try to open the door, so probably wasn't smart enough to do that. So I don't know what this was. In my mind, I'm thinking a dog man, but this is what he said, and this is the real linchpin to why I believe that it was a dog man. When his first guy came in, when his first guys, he heard him pull up and get out of the truck, and he heard him talking. He's like, I just burst out of the Porta-John, and I told him, I was like, thank God you're here. Something just tried to attack me. He's like, I was tripping over my words, you know, because I was just fumbling to say. He's sitting there telling me this, and he's looking at me with sincere eyes. I believe him. I think he was being honest about it. He had no reason to lie to me. All he knew me from was work. I could have been like, oh, you're out of your mind. I mean, but he opened up and he told me this. And he told another guard this too. And so when we were sitting there listening to this guy, I felt really bad for him, you know, and he's like, I was covered in that mess. He's like, and then I took a flashlight and I went around and I looked because it was muddy on either side of the Porta-John. He said, and there were these humongous, what looked like dog prints or wolf prints. So that was his story. That's pretty much the last one I got. And I hope everybody enjoyed it because until I can do some more research with these people, that's all I have.
Those are some amazing stories. I can't even imagine what that would have been like. For him, though, I wonder if it would have been easier on him if he would have been able to see it.
That is all perspective. I mean, I might have been happier to have not really seen what I saw and just thought, you know what? I could have chalked it up to it was who knows what. But the thing had to go up to the window and everybody saw it too. And so I knew I wasn't crazy. But It still was traumatic. I don't know. I would have preferred to have never seen it at all, but then again, I wouldn't have caught an interest in these things, and I wouldn't have been paying attention and looking for people, for witnesses, you know what I mean? And I would never be able to relay this information to people, which, who knows? It could save someone's life. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert, not at all, nowhere near. But I would strongly suggest to people not to go out looking for these things, not to try to confront these things, because missing 411, I mean, that's just, people go missing. All this stuff, like we were talking about the LBL. I don't know even near the information that you have, Vic. I mean, God only knows what you've heard. I don't know how you sleep at night, dude.
Well, sometimes it's not easy. If you do change your mind at any time, Josh, and decide to head for the LBL, about the only advice I can give you is to stay clear of the northern end.
You don't have to worry about that, dude. I'll be healthy and alive because I'm not going into these areas looking for this. I'm not going to do that. I'm not one of those people that if a guy says he has a bomb, I'm not going to go, oh, let me see your bomb. I'm good. I'll take your word for it, buddy. And that's it. Anybody that wants to go out there and mess around with this stuff, go ahead. Have fun. But don't invite me because I'm not going to go.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you at all. Well, it's about time to get out of here, Josh, but before we do, I've got a question for you. If you had it to do all over again and have the ability to take away that encounter you had and live your life not knowing that they're out there, would you rather do it that way, or do you see it as somewhat of an advantage knowing that they are out there and consequently being able to take the appropriate action to ensure that you hopefully don't have another encounter?
When we talked before, and me and you, Vic, have talked extensively, and not just in the interviews, but me and you have talked, and I like to think we're friends. And I've opened up to you, and you've shared some stories, and I've talked to you about stuff, and just besides all this, I'll be real honest with you, okay? And I'll level with the people who are listening. At one time, I really hated that it had happened to me, and I didn't like being humiliated and told that I was crazy or that I was lying or making it up. And I was so glad to get confirmation from people that I knew that lived around me that had seen these things and probably didn't have as big a mouth as me to go around and talk about it. And like I said, it gave me my nickname. It's pretty much become a part of who I am. It's not really who I am, but it's a part of who I am. And I like to think that it happened for a reason. You know, and I'm not going to say, well, I'm special, that's why it happened to me. No, because it's happened to quite a few people. But I do think that because it happened to me, I should go forward and try to find out as much as I can about them. Now, like I said, at a distance, I'm not going to go out looking for these things. But now that I've reassessed it as of late, I'm glad it happened only because I'm able to tell others about it. But the pain that I went through after it happened, it's just hard to describe. I've heard people who've claimed to have had encounters and it doesn't really seem to bother them, like we had talked about, you know, and others that it really has affected them adversely. And it did affect me. I think it affected my behavior as a teenager too. I think that it kind of left an impression on me, you know, that something happens and nobody believes you. And then when somebody does believe you, but then still people in your immediate family don't believe you, I think that it kind of drove a wedge between me and my parents to a certain degree because it was just more of me acting out is what they thought. Even when my friend, who's now a preacher, saw it too, and his family saw it, it was just still like, oh, okay, whatever. My dad was that way. My mom was that way. But I am glad that it happened because if I could help convince just one or two people to be more careful and it saves them, because I do believe that these things will kill you. I do believe they're aggressive. There's no doubt in my mind. I know there are certain people, certain authors and certain people that believe that these things are benign. They're not going to hurt anybody, but that's not my experience. And that's not what I've heard people telling me. I think the Hernandez family and the Hitchens family would beg to differ with these people about how aggressive these things can be. And I don't believe for a second that they're friendly. I believe that they're corporeal, they're real flesh and blood beings, and I think that they will kill you. I think that they're predatory. I don't know what they are. They might be evolved something or another, but they will kill you. That's my absolute positive belief. And so therefore I don't go into areas where I think that they may be.
And that could be anywhere because like in the ocean, like we talked about, sharks go everywhere. They're in the water everywhere you go. You go in the ocean, you could get attacked. You could get killed. A day of fun and frolicking at the beach could end up in you dying. It's probably not going to happen, but it could. You could go out in the woods and you're probably not going to see a dogman, but you could.
Yeah, the woods isn't the zoo. There are no bars out there. If you go out there, you're up against whatever's out there and what it might decide to do to you.
Absolutely. And you're at its mercy, dude. That's the thing. And I don't like being vulnerable. I don't like feeling vulnerable, physically vulnerable. That's the linchpin of it. If I'm in the city and I'm doing whatever, people don't scare me. I'll beat the crap out of a person. You know what I mean? I don't care. But one of those things? No way, dude. No way. You hear those stories and you're like, I just can't wrap my mind around it. People like Shane's brother running back out there with a gun. You know what? You keep that up and you'll be a victim.
Yeah, that is pretty hard to understand. Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming back on the show and telling us all these stories. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time.
No problem. Anytime, Vic. Like I said, I got some stories. I'm coming to you. And we'll do it again if I can get some more information. Hopefully it won't take a whole year for me to get back to you. I'm going to see what I can do, but hopefully.
As soon as you have those stories ready, all you need to do is to let me know. We'll get it all set up and have you come back on. I'd love to have you come back.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure for me too.
Thanks again so much and have a great night.
And you too, Vic.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.